Good morning. Welcome to the biblical explanation for the third Sunday of Advent. The Gospel reading is from the Gospel according to John, chapter 1, verses selected from 6 up to 8, and then from 19 up to 28. The first part of this reading, verses 6 up to 8, are taken from the prologue to the Gospel of John. It means from the poetic introduction to this Gospel, where the main topics are presented, and among them is mentioned that John is coming as a witness to testify to the light, so that all might believe through him. While verses 19 up to 28 are part of the narrative presentation of the activity of John the Baptist, and among them there is also a quotation taken from Isaiah chapter 40 that we had also in the reading of the last Gospel from the Mark. Here in John verse 23, "I'm the voice of the one crying out in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord." I will not talk more about this quotation from Isaiah, which in the Markan Gospel, the reading of the last Sunday, was very essential, a key element for that reading and for the explanation, and I hope that we exhausted it sufficiently. Secondly, because also this quotation in the reading of John doesn't seem to be the essential part. The reading in John is focused on testimony, on being witness to Jesus. Whenever the readings are selected in this way as this passage of the Gospel with selected verses, it requires that we should not limit ourselves to read it from lectionary or from any other resources where those readings are selected in such a way, but we should go to the Bible. We should open, in this case, the Gospel of John and read it within the literal context to understand it properly. Otherwise, such selection of verses could be compared to manipulation in mass media, when from somebody's speech are picked up few phrases and then they are presented in a twisted way. The meaning of the original presentation is lost. In the prologue that introduces the main topics of the Gospel, John is presented as a witness to testify in order that people might believe. In verse 19, it's retaking the word the testimony, but then the discourse goes in the way of questions. When they are asking John the Baptist, "Who are you?" then he answers that he is not the Messiah, so he does not identify himself with Messiah. The second question or following questions, "Are you Elijah? Are you the prophet?" Then he quotes those words from Isaiah. "I'm the voice of the one crying out in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord." And finally the question, "Why then are you baptizing if you are neither the Messiah, nor Elijah, nor the prophet?" And John's answer, "I baptize with water. Among you stands one whom you do not know, the one who is coming after me. I am not worthy to untie the tongue of his sandals." In this dialogue, John indirectly talks about Jesus. First, he does not identify himself as a Messiah, so leaves the question open, who is the Messiah? The second answer, quoting the words of Isaiah, he identified now Jesus more with these words and his role as the messenger who is announcing Jesus. And in the last answer, telling that among you stands one whom you do not know, now he points to Jesus. And the concluding words that he is not worthy to untie the tongue of his sandals, in this way indirectly he explains as this gesture, typical gesture of respect, honor to authorities in the biblical world, bowing down so much to the earth as kissing the feet, untying the tongues of the sandals, but this gesture is not enough to Jesus, because Jesus is somebody who is greater than a man. If the reading of the Gospels were only verses 19 up to 28, for sure we would focus on those questions and answers, and we could refer to the other situations, in particular those in when Jesus asked his disciples about what people think about him, who he is. Of course, such combination of the readings were from verses 6 up to 8, where there is general statement about giving witness to Jesus in order that people might believe in Jesus, and from verses 19, when there is this interrogation of John by the representatives from Jerusalem, and in those answers when John refers to Jesus in an indirect way. However, we lose some connection. Therefore, if we go to larger perspective, we would understand it better. As you can see now on the screen, I added some also essential verses for this understanding of our passage. Firstly, the verse 15, in which stays between those two passages. John testifies to him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks ahead of me because he was before me." Those words are retaken later in verse 30, which is after the reading of our passage of the Gospel for this Sunday. "This is he of whom I said, after me comes a man who ranks ahead of me because he was before me." This double statement in verses 15 and 30, which frames this interrogation of John by the representatives from Jerusalem, refers to one of the attributes of Jesus, his eternity, as it is already stated in the prologue verse 2. He was in the beginning with God. While in the answer given to the representatives in verse 27 that he is not worthy to untie the tongue of his sandals, John makes reference to the divinity of Christ. The testimony of John given to the representatives from Jerusalem in somehow enigmatic, indirect way goes now more openly, more directly in the double declaration, firstly in verse 29, when John says, "Here is the Lamb of God who takes the sin of the world," and then retaken in shorter form in verse 36, "Look, here is the Lamb of God." In between those two declarations, he is the Lamb of God, John the Baptist now makes his testimony referring to baptism of Jesus, and finally in verse 34 openly stating, "This is the Son of God," making a strong direct identification of divinity of Jesus. The second declaration, "Look, here is the Lamb of God," addressed to his disciples, makes his disciples to leave him and follow Jesus. And this situation that some of John's disciples leave him and follow Jesus, it is a nice fulfillment of the words from the prologue that all might believe. John the Baptist does not retain hijacked his disciples, but he truly moves them towards Jesus. And it is also nicely referred in another situation described in chapter 3, when they are bringing to John the Baptist information that now Jesus is also baptizing. He states, "You yourself are my witnesses that I said, I'm not the Messiah, but I have been sent ahead of him. He who has the bride is the bridegroom. The friend of the bridegroom who stands and hears him rejoices greatly at the bridegroom's voice. For this reason my joy has been fulfilled. He must increase, but I must decrease. John the Baptist is fully in service for Jesus. Later in chapter 5, Jesus makes reference to the testimony witness he received from John the Baptist, but also he states that he has a greater testimony than that of John, and that testimony are the works he accomplishes to prove, to testify that he was sent by the Father. He also makes reference in answer to his interlocutors that the scriptures give him testimony. From all the evangelists, only John is focusing so much on these two words, the verb martyreo, give witness, bear testimony, and martyria, witness, testimony, evidence. So bearing the witness to Jesus is not only done by John the Baptist, as well also by Jesus himself, but Jesus also talks that it will be the advocate, the Holy Spirit, who would testify on his behalf. In that process also the disciples would be involved, as we read here in chapter 15. When the advocate comes, whom I will send to you from the Father, the Spirit of truth, who comes from the Father, he will testify on my behalf. You also are to testify, because you have been with me from the beginning. And even John the Evangelist is aware of such a responsibility that he has to bear witness to Jesus, as he states it twice in two texts. Firstly, in chapter 19, when he describes the death of Jesus. While making this detailed description of death of Jesus, he points to himself in these words: he who saw this has testified, and his testimony is true, and he knows that he tells the truth, so that you may also believe. And his testimony takes the form of the gospel, as he makes again this personal reference to himself in chapter 21 at the conclusion of the gospel. This is the disciple who is testifying to these things and has written them, and we know that his testimony is true. Enlarging the literal context in order to understand wider the Sunday reading and seeing the importance of the testimony given to Jesus by John the Baptist, who does everything for Jesus. Even he directs his own disciples to follow Jesus. Then later seeing in the process that also the disciples of Jesus are called to be his witnesses. Therefore, we Christians have also this responsibility. The gift of faith we receive, we have to transmit to others. Wishing you a nice and blessed day and fruitful preparation for the Christmas.